Our goal tonight is somewhat different. We are to reawaken the spirit of Graham Spry, a democratic socialist and radical dreamer. Graham Spry formed a general coalition which lobbied for and won the creation of a public broadcaster under the conservative government of R.B. Bennett against the backdrop of the painful years of the recession in Canada's dirty 30s. That was a radical dream indeed. Originally, the crafters of the first Broadcast Act foresaw expropriation of private radio stations and the establishment of a public monopoly like the BBC. That dream did falter in the early years. And in the recent years, I and others here tonight fear the dream has been so compromised, so emptied of resonance to everyday Canadians, that the current model of public broadcasting in this country is in jeopardy of dying a slow death, and perhaps not even being lamented in its passing. I am indebted tonight to the Graham Spry Foundation. I am indebted to our partner, the Université de Montréal. I'm indebted to the Dean of the Faculty of Art, Communication, and Technology, Dr. Cheryl Geisler, and especially to the Director of the School of Communication, Alison Beale, who so generously supported the event this evening. We are also indebted to Open Media and the Canadian Broadcasting Museum, and especially the activist Keely Wilkinson, who worked with Graham Spry. And the discussions we have tonight will be filmed, in part to be available for teaching and public information on the Spry website, but we've also been challenged by my colleague Ron Devion, whom I will introduce shortly, to put it up on YouTube to establish our own channel. I would like to also thank Dr. Kirsten McAllister, Director of the Center for Policy Studies on Culture and Communities, for her continuing leadership on public dialogue about cultural practices. We do have a stellar lineup for you today. I have to announce some changes to the format, but I assure you our panelists will provoke some new ideas about alt futures for the CBC, and especially now that it is on the precipice of losing Hockey Night in Canada, among other changes in the age of internet broadcasting and unprecedented concentration of ownership amongst Canada's private broadcasters. And we also think it is on an easy sea of fractious and largely unknowing young public of citizens. When I teach introductory classes now, and I ask my students, for example, about hip people like Strombopoulos or Gian Gomeshi, very few hands rise in the audience anymore. We have to actually sign listening to the CBC in order for our young students to begin to recognize it. But I want to introduce now our completely Western-based panel of speakers. I regret very much to say that Wade Rowland sends his regards, but is unable to be with us because of an acute and sudden illness. Instead, we will hear Rudy Buttignol of Knowledge Network, who will speak for 15 minutes on a strategy to renew public broadcasting. Then we will turn to our panel of experts and catalysts who will provide a 3 to 5 minute point of view pieces on issues important to the CBC and other public not-for-profit media producers today. After Rudy, and I'd like you to just raise your hand and we'll have full introductions later, we will hear from Ron Devion, retired head of both CBC British Columbia and head of CBC Sports nationwide. After Ron, we will turn to Dr. Ray Scherer of the University of Alberta, over here, who will share his insight into CBC and sports, drawn from his book on sports, public broadcasting, and cultural citizenship, surely valuable in this media-saturated Olympics. After Shay, we turn to Matthias Goossen, a newly graduated and newly retired SFU Klansman, and we're proud to recognize this, who will reflect on the role of public broadcasting in building amateur sport in this country. We shift from sports to news with the Daphne Bramham, our noted columnist of the Vancouver Sun and award winner, multiple news award winner, who will reflect on the CBC's so-called legacy mandate in news, with a relentless pull to online journalism and increasing international competition. After Daphne, we turn to Rebecca Sullivan, my colleague and professor from the University of Calgary, who will talk more broadly about Canadian television today, especially challenging some of the assumptions of precarity of Canadian identity and economics of Canadian TV production, which were so dominant in the days of Graham Spry's era. After Rebecca, we turn to Dr. Zoë Druick, on my right over here, who examines the changes in private broadcasting, the move to group licensing, and the migration of TV production to more reruns on different platforms, in short. After Zoë, we turn to Frédérik Lesage, on my extreme left, of Simon Fraser University, who will look at the implication of the age of apps for a public content provider. And we wrap up in this rapid-fire point-of-view session with Reilly Yeo of openmedia.ca. Reilly's in the center, deep in her computer right at the moment, and now waving, who will give us a thoroughly modern take on social media grassroots campaigns to reimagine the CBC, updating the public movement of the Canadian Radio League in the 30s to 2014. We will then turn to public discussion and adjourn for broader tea and coffee, hopefully by 9 or 9:15. A few final words of protocol. For those of you who are still cold, there is hot beverage up there. I also would like to acknowledge CJSF, SFU's campus radio station, will be audio taping this event, and it is all for educational non-for-profit use. And the cameras will record the panelists for an educational video posted on the Spry site and hopefully a YouTube channel. So now let us turn to the 14th annual Spry keynote speaker on alt futures. On very short notice, Rudy Buttignol agreed to step in, and we are grateful to him. He is the ideal candidate. Rudy was the first to critique Wade Rowland's argument for a non-commercial CBC in a very provocative review in the Literary Review of Canada. He is CEO of Knowledge Network and has single-handedly led Knowledge in a turnaround in audience ratings, making it frequently the fourth-ranked or even higher station in Vancouver CMA in the Nielsen ratings, and also increasing the membership of partners in Knowledge despite a very active PBS in our province. Knowledge has also completely remade its schedule to counter-program against commercial stations and is now commissioning essential documentaries like the exceptional recent series on life and death at the VGH. I'm partial to this because my son volunteers in the VGH Emerge room. And need I remind you, Knowledge does this all on a shoestring of a budget without ads. And it is just one of two out of 4 educational public broadcasters to avoid the bullet of privatization by provincial broadcasters in the past decade. I'm very honored to introduce Mr. Rudy Buttignol. Thank you, Rudy.
Thanks, Catherine. Good evening, everyone. Are you warm enough? Yeah, are you sure? I'm going to keep my own time here, Catherine. I've just learned how to use my countdown clock. There, so I'm going to try to stick to 15 minutes. Thank you very much for the plug for Knowledge Network. I brought a whole bunch of magazines because we're the full-service network. Even the CEO has to get out and say, this is the magazine and the TV guide that we publish twice or 6 times a year. It's available to people that donate to Knowledge Network, and we always, if you're really interested, you can call in. We'll give you the first issue for free. It's part of our fundraising drive every year. We ask people to give us money, just like PBS. It used to be called Pledge, but I realized that when I would go to workshops in Europe and Asia to fellow broadcasters, they didn't know what the idea of asking the public who were watching to actually give you money, it didn't compute. So I said, it's crowdfunding. And oh, crowdfunding, that's great. When did you start? And I said, about 35 years ago. So some things that are new were actually old. Anyways, thank Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you this evening. It's a subject that's dear to my heart, obviously. I don't normally publicly comment about the CBC. It's just I made it a personal policy. I figured that public sector institutions don't need some rearguard action from other public institutions. We've got enough of our own battles to fight without one more critic piling on. And so I'm always very careful about it. And with the review, Wade Rowland's book that I reviewed, it was the exception. It was for the Literary Review of Canada, and I thought it was an important moment to do it. And like tonight, to actually speak publicly about an institution that is continually threatened, and sometimes it's worse that it doesn't get killed, but just damaged over and over again. And so, but I wanted to let you know my own feelings about the national public broadcaster, and that is that I do believe that we need one. We need a national public broadcaster. I believe that it should be a commercial-free public broadcaster, and that it, most importantly, should be at arm's length to government. That is, a public broadcaster, not a state broadcaster. And although I'm actually quite neutral on what kind of programming should be on a broadcaster, there is the one element of it that I think is essential for every public broadcaster in the world, and that is news, journalism, done free of government interference, done free from commercial pressure. It's the only genre that I think is absolutely essential. My own personal bias, so that you understand where I'm coming from, and you can take everything I say with a grain or two of salt, is that I've come from my first half of my career, about 20 years, was as an independent producer doing largely documentaries, children's programming, and a whole lot of commercial programming to earn a living and support a family. The last 21 plus years has been as a public broadcaster, first at TV Ontario, Ontario's public broadcaster. I started there as a commissioning editor for documentaries and eventually became head of network programming. And the last 7 years here in Burnaby, in beautiful British Columbia, to run British Columbia's knowledge network. I have a strong belief in independent voices through the medium of independent production. I'm a big believer that it's through independent production that we help support independent voices. And I believe that it's good to get public funding from the public that actually watches and listens to the service. The question that I read that Catherine had put out for this evening was, is the Canadian audiovisual regulatory system in need of reinvention? And if so, whither the CBC and the CRTC? Now, we're not going to talk too much about the CRTC, but I'll focus largely on the CBC, and the answer is yes, it does need reinvention. And I just want to make it clear that I, unlike many of my colleagues both inside the CBC and outside, I don't think it's about money. You can always use money, but I've never met anyone in any organization that couldn't use more money. So, and if it's a problem all the time, then it can't really be a problem. It's just what it is. It's the oxygen. I think it's really about governance, and it's about the mandate for a 21st century environment. Things have changed globally. The technology, particularly digital technology, has overturned everything. Globalization has affected every facet of life, and we've lived through over 30 years of deregulatory environments. 30 years of deregulation. That's the environment of the 21st century, and we're not going back anytime soon. And in that environment, I think that it's important that the CBC have an arm's length relationship to the government, and that instead of the pursuit of money that's not there or money that comes from commercials, because I think it should be a commercial-free public service working in the public interest, that it has to move towards matching the available resources to the matching the mandate to the available resources. There's a lot of things that anybody can do, but you have to just do the most important things based on the resources that you have at hand. Briefly about the CRTC, I think we've been living for 30 years under the law of unintended consequences, no matter whether the CRTC has been market-oriented or whether it has been centrally directed. It seems to create unintended consequences. I think it's helped promote, foster the concentration of media and the curtailing of independent voices on one hand. And I think its laissez-faire attitude to the internet is very old-fashioned. In fact, it should regulate the internet. Why shouldn't it? It runs over, it's a public conveyance, runs over public space, like everything else. We regulate fishing and hunting. Why wouldn't we regulate this incredible resource? So that's my position. And currently the fashion of pick and pay, which is the federal government said we want more consumer choice with in cable packages and satellite packages. This is going to be the law of unintended consequences, because it will definitely lead to less choice and truly crush the last of independent voices in the hands of some concentrated big telcos. So Wade Rowland's book, Saving the CBC, Balancing Profit and Public Service. I wrote an essay and a book review for the Literary Review of Canada. My essay, like the book, focused largely on CBC English television. When people complain about the CBC, at the end of the day, what I hear is that really complaining about the television service. We're going to put the French language service somewhere else. It's on Mars, it lives in another universe, and has a whole other dynamic, which I will not speak to because Wade didn't really address. And CBC Radio, he didn't talk a lot about it. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. It was commercial free when I was writing the review. Then I had to revise it after the CRTC said they could introduce advertising, which was crazy, because CBC, on a tiny budget, because it gets cut every year, actually has an incredibly loyal audience. When you ask people about the CBC radio, they'll tell you they actually love the service. And they're incredibly loyal. And not surprisingly, one of the biggest donor base for Knowledge Network are CBC radio listeners. It's the reason why we have Sheila Rogers, Vicky Gabriel, and Bill Richardson pledging, asking our viewers to call in and donate. So the idea of taking something that works, it's sort of like the people at CBC Radio or the CBC television have never walked over to radio and asked them what they were doing. Never talked to an audience member to say, does it work for you? Wade Rowland came up with 10 prescriptions for saving the CBC. I'm going to list them all here, but I'm only going to talk about a few. And in his order, 1, eliminate advertising. You obviously know that I agree with that. 2, replace lost advertising with new government funding. We'll come back to that. 3, drop professional sports and go to amateur sport, something that's already kind of happened since the book came out. 4, cut all independent commissioning and acquisitions and go to an in-house model. Well, you know my bias. I think that that's a non-starter. 5, the board of directors should hire its CEO instead of having it appoint the CEO being appointed by the federal cabinet. 6, accountability through public consultation and input on decision-making. That kind of scares me a little bit, not the accountability part, but just having a lot of people in the back seat. 7, expand CBC Radio to an over-the-air network, a minimum of 1 focused on the arts. 8, more specialty channels. 9, more web-based digital services. And 10, restore TV and radio stations in the smaller communities. Now, my issue with Wade's 10 prescriptions is because the issues I had with the book in a review is that I thought he focused way too much on programming and operational issues that are best left to professionals, and rather I would have preferred to see what I think is needed is a values-based policy framework designed for the new environment, the technological change, globalization, and deregulation, all in the atmosphere of limited government budgets. These government budgets are limited the worldwide. And it's something there's no government that's going to open its pocketbooks anytime soon. And I think that's what we need, a values-based policy framework. Now, let me tell you a personal issue that I had with Wade Rowland's book. There are provincial public networks, and there are some lessons to learn from the public networks because they've been around for 30 and 40 years. In the book on public broadcasting in Canada, it got precisely 1/2 of a sentence mentioned. And it is so short that I will read it to you now word for word, and I'll be very slow to actually appreciate it. Quote, education has been downloaded to the provincial public service broadcasters where they exist, ... end quote. That's it. It's sort of like, where have you been living? You know, have you not seen that there are other services that are actually successful to certain degrees? So that's my own personal peeve because there are lessons to learn. It's not that we do everything right, but there's some things that we're doing right. In some cases, we're thriving. In some cases, Knowledge Network is actually flourishing. And so there were some lessons learned. Now I'm going to deal with 4 of his prescriptions, and 2 of them I've combined into a single issue, and that is 1, eliminate advertising and professional sports. 2, I'm going to deal with new government funding to replace lost advertising, and 3, a board of directors hiring its own CEO. So let's go to the first one. Eliminate advertising. Yes, obviously I agree. If you eliminate advertising, all else will follow. There's no need to prescribe programming and operational issues. Those, I think, in my opinion, are best left to the talented people with ability and experience that can design a schedule or an operational organization that's suited for that time, because broadcasting, like everything else, is a moving target. Year to year, things change, viewers change, technology changes, and you can't fix it in time. It needs to be left to professionals. I think that getting rid of pro sports is important because it has a distorting effect. Just look at the effect of the National Hockey League. How a single organization based in New York could have so much control over a public broadcasting entity. And now that control has moved from the New York office of the NHL to Rogers. Rogers not only has full financial control of the NHL on CBC, they have full editorial control for essentially all of Saturday on the public broadcaster. And that's just mind-boggling. The point is, everyone knew, like Radio Canada, NHL was going. So great, it's fantastic, it's a legacy item, and should bid it farewell. This is just, the editorial control in the hands of a private entity are just maddening to think about. Now, Wade suggests that they move from, that the CBC would move from professional sport to amateur sport. But I wonder, I believe the Olympics are still classified as amateur sport. Have you seen the reports from Sochi? I had a troubling effect last night, and if I thought the NHL was scary, what about the International Olympic Committee, which some people have called the most opaque and corrupt organization there is? And look at their effect on the news. And I saw something just the other night. I turned to Peter Mansbridge was broadcasting, anchoring the national news from Sochi. And he turned through to a couple of his reporters who were talking about the corruption, about the people that have been displaced from Sochi in order to make way for these massively expensive games. They were talking about how it was over, people had spent a fortune on it. Well, I'm not a Russian taxpayer. I don't really care if they blew their budget on it. But they were talking about the misery inflicted on people and the corruption and referring to it as Putin's game. Some pretty tough stuff. And then they cut back to Peter. And Peter said, and now for all the great Canadians that are going to be competing in the Olympics, without ever stopping for a moment to wonder, could we question perhaps that there's a sense of hypocrisy here, that we're continuing to this? Maybe there isn't, but do you think as a journalist he would have asked the question? Instead, he became a shill for the International Olympic Committee. Now, irrespective of what you might think of the Olympics, that's not what I think the national public broadcaster head, the chief of news, the chief correspondent should be doing. So even amateur sport can have a perverting or distorting effect. Advertising drives the need for ratings. That's what you learn when you program for television. And you know what? It drives the need for ratings and drives the needs for demos, because advertisers don't care about the whole audience. They only care about the audience that's going to buy their product. That means if you're a young child, they don't care about you. Excuse me. If you're a senior citizen, you've already decided on your brands, we don't care about you. And that's the distortion of advertising. Number 2, new government funding to replace lost advertising. That was Wade's prescription. Does anybody in their right mind think that that's realistic? That that's going to happen anytime soon? I don't think so. And if anybody thinks it's a function, the cuts that are happening to the CBC now are a function of a conservative government in Ottawa, they better look back in their history and see that some of the biggest cuts, in fact, the biggest single cut to the CBC happened in the 90s under Jean Chrétien's Liberal government. And no federal government's been that friendly to the CBC in a long time. So that's not happening. And I've seen critics scoff when there's no new money, when there's talk about no new money for the CBC. They scoff and say, what? Should the CBC become the PBS of the North and shill for dollars from their public? As if that's somehow beneath you is to ask the public that watches you to actually give money, whereas having to go cap in hand to the NHL or the International Organizing Committee is somehow more noble. It's crazy. I think what the CBC needs is a mandate matched with the resources available. It cannot do everything that it needs to do. I think it needs a new role as a complement and a supplement to the commercial networks, and it has to recognize that the provincial networks actually exist. Tele-Quebec, Tele-Franco-Ontarienne in Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and parts of Manitoba, TV Ontario, my old stomping ground, and of course, Knowledge Network. Wade Rowland talks about the threat of privatization to the CBC, but the CBC has never been put under privatization review. And the educational networks, the provincial networks, have actually gone under provincial privatization review. Access Alberta was the first. It was going to be the model for commercially run public broadcasting. Today it's called CTV2. Saskatchewan's SCN Communications was privatized. It's now become Rogers City Station. And it gets a favorable position on the dial because it still has the designation of Saskatchewan's educational network. And TVO and KNC and Knowledge Network were both under privatization review, but emerged from privatization with a new mandate to maintain and improve. What's the difference? Well, I'll tell you what the difference was. Access Alberta had no public support from members. SCN had no public support from members. At my time when I was driving the on-air, running the on-air membership drives on TVO, we had 100,000 members, and today I can proudly report that Knowledge Network has 38,000 people who actively donate to our service every year. Those people, the reason I mention them is those people represent a big group of strong political voices. Because the people that donate tend to be older, everyone knows they tend to be the people that actually march out to the polling booths and vote. And that's where that becomes important for a public broadcaster. And it leads me to my third point, which is the board of directors hiring the CEO. Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that a public broadcaster needs someone to run the organization at arm's length to the government. The government should properly protect the taxpayers' interest by appointing a board. The board, in turn, should select its CEO, and the CEO should protect the editorial independence of that institution for the benefit of the taxpayer. That's the virtuous circle. That's how proper organizations are run. Public support is needed, though, to motivate a prime minister and a cabinet. Until that happens, nothing's going to happen to the CBC, in my opinion. I've seen it happen. I've seen it over and over again. That's the level of support that it needs to make a governance change. Is it possible to happen here in British Columbia? Knowledge Network was under privatization review for 4 years. And the case was made over and over again. It had a membership base, and lo and behold, the government said, we're going to maintain it, improve it, give it enough resources to make the transition to digital, but you have to raise the rest of the money yourself, and we'll give you a base grant, and you go forward from it. And that actually has happened. In other words, we've earned the political support of the government to give us the base grant by demonstrating that the public supported its public broadcaster. And that's really important, and I don't think much is going to happen until that happens. On the CRTC, I'm going to close, Catherine, because I went a little bit over. The CRTC, the law of unintended consequences. If the CRTC wants to ensure the diversity of voices in the face of corporate concentration, it's got to support independent programming services. I think the CRTC should regulate the internet. And organizations like Netflix are getting a free ride here. They don't obey the rules of the road. They have no obligations. Why shouldn't they be regulated? And 3, the pick and pay issue that sounds like a great illusion of consumer choice is actually going to lead to more concentration and less choice. And I don't know if that is provocative for some people, but I thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are going to move to our next presenter now, and I'm going to introduce Ron Devion. Now, he, in fact, believes that Canadians may be willing to pay more, and is going to pose you the question, if indeed you believe more might be able to be devoted to the CBC and public budgets. This is a $64,000 question, to put it lightly. Ron has a 40-year career with the CBC from 1955 to 1995, was TV program director of CBC Sports, the head of CBC Sports and director of television for CBC BC, and has written 2 memoirs exposing some of what went on behind the curtain at the CBC, and I commend these books to you, From Stardust and From Stardust Book 2. I'd like to introduce Ron. Thank you very much.
Before I start with my remarks, I dressed for the occasion. For those of you who don't know, this is the CBC's original logo. It's 77 years old this year. It was created in 1936, and for any of you who are lovers of good graphics, I think it still stands up today. Groucho Marx said of television, it's very educational. Somebody turns on the set, I go into the other room and read a book. His point was simply this: it's mostly sound bites, spin, and eye candy, interrupted by commercials to sell us stuff we really don't need. The $5.2 billion NHL Rogers 12-year rights deal threw a hand grenade at CBC with a 4-year time fuse. In October, Hockey Night in Canada will be editorially controlled by the folks at Rogers. They will retain all related revenue, potentially as much as $200 million of CBC's annual ad revenue. Hockey Night in Canada will continue on CBC for 4 more years, temporarily filling 350 primetime hours of popular content. This interregnum also provides Rogers a 4-year window to figure out how much to charge fans to watch their favorite sports on their platforms, and also how they will persuade their shareholders that giving Gary Bettman $5.2 billion somehow enhances their bottom line. And remember, NBC signed a 10-year deal with Gary Bettman for $2.2 billion in a market 10 times the size of ours. The loss of such a large chunk of annual ad revenue, on top of absorbing ongoing cuts imposed by the feds, plus in 4 years' time, finding money to fill 350 hours of Canadian content, is a devastating and potentially lethal blow to the corporation. Ironically, this convergence of events provides a timely opportunity for CBC to change the direction it has taken in the past decade or more. Use the 4 years to become a non-commercial, content-relevant public service broadcaster. Are any of our elected politicians and appointed CBC board members prepared to demonstrate the necessary courage, vision, tenacity, and leadership required? Their silence, while events conspire to disembowel a once vital cultural institution, is astonishing. Taxpayers have a right to be informed about the real situation facing their public broadcaster. If the next 4 years are not dedicated to this task, CBC's English language television service will be first to disappear. The model is CBC Radio 1, where audiences are increasing because it provides non-commercial, relevant content. A little-known fact to most taxpayers: we pay only $34 per year to support all of CBC's English, French, and Aboriginal services. A measly $54 per capita per year provides the sustenance to achieve a laudable goal: to inform, enlighten, and entertain. If cost benefit or value for money is your thing, compare $54 to the cost of attending only one NHL game, or $96 a year for Netflix. The dwindling handful of media corporations that control everything we read, hear, and see complain to those who govern us about the unfairness of CBC's tax support while remaining silent about their subsidy. The solution is relatively simple, and there is no need to increase taxes. Let private media corporations keep all advertising revenue in the Canadian market in exchange for a portion of their tax subsidy going to a refocused, contemporary, non-commercial, content-relevant Canadian public service broadcaster. If protecting our democratic and cultural sovereignty is the end game, this objective is worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Ron. I can see people sort of getting ready to intervene with public discussion, so hold that thought. Take a note right now. We'll come back to it. I want to turn to our next speaker all the way from the University of Alberta. Thank you very much, Dr. Jay Scherer. Now, he wrote a book in 2103, I understand, 2013, apologies, up there, on sport, public broadcasting, and cultural citizenship. We're delighted to have Jay with us because he is the recipient of the 2013 Sport Information Resource Center Research Award for the impact of sport on the community, and teaches at the Faculty of Physical Education and Recreation at the University of Alberta. Please welcome Jay Scherer.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here in this summer weather. We are, as the first two speakers have duly noted, I think, on the precipice of perhaps the most significant debate about public broadcasting, at least in my memory, thanks to a number of issues. The most significant being, as we've just heard, the recent deal between Rogers and the NHL for $5.2 billion over a 12-year period. And it's simply a staggering amount of money if you think about it. I'm not going to go over the details of the arrangement because I think Ron just did. He also spoke about the 4-year extension that a couple of people have referred to as the CBC being thrown a lifeboat despite sinking very quickly, to have 4 years to come up and reinvent itself, to make significant changes in terms of programming content in light of the loss of Hockey Night in Canada. Hockey Night in Canada, of course, has been the most popular program on the CBC. It's an over 60-year television tradition for Canadians, longer than that if you consider the radio era before. And it's a massive, massive loss for the public broadcaster in terms of half of its advertising revenue and over 300 hours of primetime Canadian content. And we've got 4 years to come to terms with it. And 4 years to come up with some type of political agenda that's going to, for my hopes, and I think most people in the audience, revitalize what's been a very dark time for the CBC for the number of years. I think a number of you know how we got to this point in terms of sports in Canada, indeed North America, the growth of vertically integrated and highly capitalized telecommunication giants like Rogers and BCE, the escalation of sports broadcasting rights, the value of those rights to unprecedented levels, and successive governments, liberal and conservative, decimating the CBC. And here we are today. So, the question is, of course, where do we go in the future? And this is difficult to imagine for a number of reasons, in part because it involves speculating on things like the CBC's future parliamentary appropriation, whether advertising will be involved, and if there are alternative funding models that we can consider, like a tax on distributors in the private sector, for example, that could be used to support public broadcasting in Canada. And I think we're all aware of the importance of the next federal election in 2015 and the impact that's going to have on the CBC. For many, I think the idea of raising a tax on distributors or asking Canadians to pay more is admittedly a difficult proposition, although, as Ron noted, $30 each is what we're paying, essentially. It's difficult to imagine, even be more difficult if the Conservatives win, in part because of the dominance of an anti-tax ideology and a political agenda that's taken direct aim at the public sector in Canada and has tried to erode the very idea that Canadians have a stake in public broadcasting and in institutions like the CBC, and hence should pay for them. Moreover, there's certainly a constituency of Canadians who'd like to see the public broadcaster simply fade to black as soon as possible. There's another constituency who've long believed that the CBC should be transformed into a subscriber-supported model, sort of a PBS of the North, or privatized entirely and left to fend for itself against its market competitors. And for decades, many of these pundits have argued that the CBC should likewise simply leave professional sport to the private sector and focus on providing the type of content that the private sector would never even contemplate providing, simply because it's not profitable. On the other side of the coin, I think there's a constituency of Canadians who passionately support public broadcasting, but who've also argued that the CBC should focus on providing content that the private sector was unwilling to. And if possible, indeed, eliminate a dependency on advertising altogether. Coincidentally, this is also a constituency of Canadians who've also argued that the CBC should leave professional sport to the private sector as well. Until the most recent NHL contract with Rogers, I've argued against both those positions. But obviously, the unprecedented escalation of the price of sports broadcasting rights in North America has simply made those arguments untenable. That said, in my opinion, I think we need to think really carefully about any political position that further shrinks the role and visibility in the lives of the CBC and the lives of ordinary Canadians. The CBC needs to be able to produce genuinely popular programs that, when possible, reach a broad national audience of viewers, and that the CBC should not be ashamed in trying to do so. The CBC can't simply become the network of the elite, of high culture, of high arts, and political dialogue. It has to crucially provide the type of content that young Canadians are interested in across a range of platforms so that they feel they have a stake in the CBC, a sense of ownership, and perhaps even a sense that they should pay for it. And I'm not talking here about airing reruns or Wheel of Fortune or programs like Jeopardy. For generations of Canadians, Hockey Night in Canada served this function, and it's now up to us to imagine a public broadcaster that can make similar types of connections with that Hockey Night in Canada was able to with Canadians from across the country as a key source of our most vivid experiences of fun, community, and a sense of being Canadian. And I think that's the discussion that we need to have as we move into the future in the next 4 years. Thank you very much.
It's okay to be like they do in the House of Commons if you want to, just whatever. We can rumble it up a bit. I want to turn now to the question of sports and amateur sports, and this is our last sort of sports-oriented thematic, and introduce Matthias Goossen, who is a recent graduand, yay, of an undergraduate degree in communication at SFU. I met Matthias, I had the privilege of meeting Matthias in one of my courses, and cottoned him, actually dragooned him into doing this tonight, because he's committed to the development of amateur sport in Canada and has served as anchored a young clan offensive line in football at SFU for quite some years, and was named in 2012 to the first team of conference All-Stars, and like many young Canadians has aspirations to move into professional CFL, hopefully here in the West Coast. So Matthias is going to talk next. Thank you.
As Dr. Murray stated, last semester I was one of her students, and like she said, she sort of pinned me in she sort of gave some positive peer pressure when I was, before class, I was speaking with one of my colleagues about my past game, and she sort of said, hey, you want to be a part of my event? I'm like, I guess I am now, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm really honored, and I just want to begin by starting and saying that, contrary to popular belief, not all Canadians play hockey or race around the mountains during winter. There are many Canadian athletes are actually involved in non-Canadian athletics that are not really recognized. And I guess we tend to leave those sports such as football, basketball, and baseball to the American side. And I believe that those kind of sports are really growing a lot in BC especially. And I came across one stat that said since 1985, the population of Canada has grown by 10 million people. Yet since that time, the hockey registration has actually decreased by 25%. And I was one of those kids who abandoned the skates for a sport better suited for my liking. And as she said, the sport is football because, obviously I can't really play too much else. And for the past 4 seasons, I played at SFU. And in my time at SFU, I really realized how little coverage is given to the amateur sport level, even at SFU, which I believe is a very high level of football. It should be recognized at that kind of level. And I believe my perspective and my experience at SFU gives me a unique viewpoint on this kind of lack of coverage. So for those of you who don't know, SFU participates in the NCAA Division II. And this means we play teams in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and California. And everybody here knows is that football in the States is way bigger than it's up here. And some examples of that, when you go to games, our games maybe have 600 fans, their games have 7,000 fans, and that kind of stuff I understand. But one time I remember one clear instance, after a game in Utah, we came back from a tough game in the hotel, watching TV, so we were trying to relax a bit before the flight took off, and my game was on. The game I just played an hour ago was on local TV, and I thought that was so interesting because in my 14-year career of playing football, I never once was broadcasted or ever saw myself on TV, and I thought that was a really cool experience. I believe that local broadcaster didn't do it as an act of service. He didn't do it as an act of kindness or, oh, let's give these guys a bit of love on TV. I believe they actually realized the potential and the level of football that was being played. And for example, SFU sends multiple athletes to the CFL every single year, and our American opponents have sent people to the NFL every year since I've been a part there. So every game you watch from my conference or from an SFU game has people of CFL potential and NFL potential. I believe that's something that a local broadcaster such as CBC should really recognize and take advantage of, because I'm not comparing us to CFL or NFL. I'm just saying that there's a lot of people at that level who have the potential to play at that certain high level, which is broadcasted to millions of people worldwide. And in closing, I just want to say that, obviously everybody knows that we're going to dominate the Olympics and that the Winter Olympics is Canada's game. But I truly believe that Canada is an elite athletic nation that shouldn't just be looked at the Winter Olympic lens. I believe we should strive to be a very top athletic nation in a lot of other sports as well. And therefore, I believe that it starts at the amateur level because at one point, every elite Canadian athlete was an amateur trying to get noticed. Thanks for listening to me. Yeah. Thank you.
That's why you're a university teacher. Okay, so next we move it up a little and we turn to one of the core mandates to inform as well as enlighten and entertain of the CBC. And we turn to questions about the CBC's role as one, first of all, a public news agency, and secondly, a legacy news foundation in this country. And I'm really honored to have Daphne Bramham with us tonight. She is a columnist with the Vancouver Sun, is a frequently awarded and a finalist in the National Newspaper Awards in 2012. She's three-time winner of the Beyond Borders Media Award, and many of us know her through her pioneering on polygamy and the coverage of the story at Bountiful. We're really delighted that she has an honorary doctorate from Capilano University in 2013, and welcome Daphne tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I don't know if I'm moving it up a notch. I did start as a sports reporter, and I have covered 2 Olympics, and I'm totally a big fan of the CFL, so I hope you go to the Rough Riders, which is my team. I am a supporter of public broadcasting. I support it in principle, but not always in practice. I recall too many times early in my career where I would go to events and there would be so many people from the CBC that the rest of us felt like we didn't need to be in the room. And while I do empathize, however, with the cuts to the CBC, but I would like to also express the fact that what the CBC is going through in terms of news is almost nothing compared to what the private sector news gatherers are going through in the private sector media. What we are in the middle of is a transitional period where we are trying very hard to understand how to make news, how to cover news and how to pay to cover news. There is no magic bullet for monetizing news. There is no one who seems to know how to do it. My company doesn't know how to do it. CBC doesn't know how to do it. None of the major companies in the United States know how to do it either. We're all struggling. The reason we're struggling is because for so long people have lived under the illusion that news is free or virtually free. For a long time in this country, we never paid for television at all. For newspapers, mostly we paid a small subscription fee. We paid a small portion of what news really costs. So we're in this period of needing to totally rethink everything about the media, how television works, how radio works, and because whatever hasn't changed yet is going to change still. We need to think about what this means for public broadcasting. We need to think about what it means for regulating. We need to think more broadly about what this means for our democracy and informing citizens about the place that they live. I do want to say something about CBC in the entertainment context, and particularly CBC television. I think it's reasonable, as some of the others have said, that we should even question whether there is a role for CBC television in a radically changed landscape. One thing that is becoming clear, has become clear for some time, is that the news media is no longer segmented. I was at a training session 2 weeks ago where I was learning to shoot video. I'm a columnist. In the old days, columnists didn't have to do nearly things like that. We now are expected to carry video cameras or iPhones. We're expected to learn how to edit videos. I do podcasts, I tweet, I blog, I do Facebook, and I write 3 columns a week. And I'm supposed to do all of these things at a high quality level. The same, I have to say, is true at the CBC. It's the same at CTV. Anyone who's a journalist these days is a multitasker. And what the CBC people are learning to do is the thing that we always used to do better, which is print. But we're all competing for the same audience, and we're competing for the same advertisers. And what makes this competition even tougher is that there are people who are doing similar things to what we do, and they're doing it for nothing. They're called bloggers, and they're called alternative websites. And among those alternative websites are some of the very ones that are most critical of the mainstream media, but they're not paying their employees. They're taking all of the writers' work, the videographers' work, the photographers' work for nothing. And so that's their competitive advantage. In the meantime, the company that I work for has what we call legacy costs, which include a whole bunch of pressmen and a really big press, and really many fewer readers than we used to. The other thing that we're competing against, all of us, including CBC, is that many major corporations are now experimenting with their own kind of news content. Ironically, they're often hiring journalists, including some of my friends, who have been laid off from traditional media outlets or who have taken voluntary buyouts. Again, we're competing not only for audience, but for advertising dollars. Where we made a mistake along the way is that most people thought that news was free. News gathering is extraordinarily expensive. CBC it used to have one of the largest news gathering budgets. It had more foreign correspondents than anybody else. And unfortunately, for all of us, they no longer have many of those people. They no longer have many of those bureaus. And on the other problem that I think is that they're allowing many young journalists desperate for jobs to go into very dangerous circumstances without anywhere near the support that they need to make sure that they get home safely. We compounded that in the private sector by giving away news free on the internet when it came along. Only belatedly have we started to charge for content. And the damage is done now, however. Most people don't think they need to pay, and there are ways around that. There are forever ways around that. I know I'm running out of time. So Roland Wade suggested that the government should remove advertising from the public broadcaster and hand over that advertising market to the private broadcasters. The problem that I have with that argument is that if you look at the statistics, there soon won't be a market at all. There are fewer and fewer people watching television, the advertisers are fleeing television, and where they're putting their money now is in mobile. And Marshall McLuhan a long time ago said that the medium is the message, and I'll tell you, in this changing landscape, it truly is. If I'd been speaking to you a year ago, I probably would have said that the future, the big future, at least as that we were being told, is tablets. Everybody's going to go to tablets. That's where advertising is going to go. Right now, everybody thinks it's going to mobile. That's why Rogers paid so much money. Everybody thinks now this is where it's going to be. And the problem is that nobody knows where it's going to go. In this landscape, in this transitional time, I think it's even more important than ever that we support public broadcasting, because there are going to be a lot of people and a lot of organizations that don't survive this transition. We need to know that there is that there's a Canadian voice in other countries. We need to know that we're getting news that is told to us through a lens that is Canadian. We need to know that there is somebody who is going to tell our stories. And I would suggest that there are some things that the CBC is already doing right. I would suggest that the crossover, for example, of Jian Gomeshi's Q, television and radio, is one thing they're doing right. And it's something that they might be able to expand to. I think it'll be interesting as the Olympics roll out to see how they're using the various platforms. And I think that we can look forward to many more changes in the same. But I want to just end on this one note. Newspapers are what we used to call newspapers, because we're not supposed to call it that anymore where I work. The print product. The print product remains the largest, the biggest news content providers in this country and in North America. One of the things that irks me more than anything else is to listen to CBC Radio, which I'm a big fan of, to listen to their morning local news and hear stories ripped and read from newspapers without any suggestion that they came from somewhere else. And I would say that is one of the things that irks me about the CBC. We need to, as much as I like that, what we're seeing already with the CBC is that their news gathering is no longer what it should be. And I think that what we need to look at in the future are different kinds of collaboration. I think many people have talked about the funding for the CBC, but I think we need to look more broadly than that. I think we need to consider things like charitable foundations being set up, or specifically establishing media and reporting organizations to fund the kind of investigative reporting that we all desperately need. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to change it up a little in terms of focus. My colleague from the University of Calgary, Dr. Rebecca Sullivan, is going to talk to us about the CBC and surviving Canadian television. She wrote something pretty provocative in 2009. At least it created some kind of frisson throughout the academic community. And it was entitled Surviving the Slings and Arrows of Canadian Television, a Case Study of Success. She's with us from the Institute for Gender Research and a professor in the Department of English at the University of Calgary. Welcome, Rebecca Sullivan.
Just a note, I'm actually wearing my reading glasses, which I'm kind of new to. So if it looks like I'm glaring at any of you, it's because I can't see any of you. It's all very new, this aging thing of me. I took the title that I was asked to speak on and twisted it around a little bit. I called it Occupy Public Media, Thoughts from a Survivor of Public Broadcasting. And I want to open my statement with a positive statement. I do believe that there is a role, a very necessary and important role, for public, community-activated media in this country. That role is to be a provocateur, an experimenter, a social critic, and a visionary artist. But I'm just not as convinced that there's a role for a national public broadcaster anymore, at least in the model that we have today. For as long as I can remember, CBC has been in survival mode. And this isn't unique to television. I think all of Canadian culture has been defining itself around this idea of survival. Certainly Margaret Atwood thought that in 1973, and many people still believe that. I think what's interesting is we have these metaphors. We have survival in Canadian literature. We have Robert Fotheringill's cowards, bullies, and clowns to describe Canadian film. But when I went to write my book, Canadian Television Today, in 2007, and I wrote that with Dr. Bart Beattie, we couldn't really find that metaphor for Canadian television because nobody watches Canadian television. Nobody had written about it. We talk about the CBC, we talk about we need our stories told, but there was very little in 2007, in fact, pretty much nothing about those stories on television because we don't watch them. So then what does it mean to survive Canadian broadcasting? Well, I think in the first instance, it meant survival against the cultural imperialism of the United States. We wanted our stories. We didn't want to be watching American programming, except that is, in fact, what we were all watching. In 2012, Survival was re-released by Margaret Atwood, by Nancy Press, I should say, with a new preface by Margaret Atwood. And she suggested that survival means something much more ominous now, because it's not about protecting ourselves from forces without. It's now about protecting ourselves from forces within. Canadian culture is struggling for survival against the forces of neoliberalism and globalization. Canadian culture is struggling for survival against the dismantling of a national identity that many public broadcasting supporters hold dear, one of multiculturalism, bilingualism, and middle-brow taste. As Atwood put it, and I'll let her say it because she says it so much better than I ever could, it isn't dreariness we fear now, as much as irreparable and self-inflicted disaster. Well, I'm going to put it to you rather provocatively, as I did in 2007, and I want to say it again. I think the CBC is in a state of irreparable and self-inflicted disaster, as is broadcasting in general. As my colleague Daphne pointed out, it's not like the private sector's going gangbusters. Just this morning, I was reading that NBC has canceled the Michael J. Fox show. I mean, Michael J. Fox can't get a TV show off the ground anymore. Broadcasting's in trouble across the board. And to struggle to maintain a model of public broadcasting the way it used to be, if it ever was, I'm not sure that's really where our money's worth. So here's why I think CBC is doomed. And I'm going to turn to Margaret Atwood again. Margaret Atwood used as a corollary to survival that to talk in terms of survival is to also be talking in terms of victimization. Victimization and a trope of denial. And I think CBC has always been in a state of denial. It has dealt nonstop with critics from left and right saying, that's not my country, you're not representing my values, that's not what I'm about. Those voices are never going to change. And as much as I love romanticism, I love the belief that can't we get people to agree to everybody chip in? It's like, well, I'm only chipping in if it's going to speak to me. And CBC can't do that. It can't speak to everyone. It's one network. It's one broadcaster. So it tries to speak to this middle ground and then feels victimized because people are upset. Displacement. The CBC is caught in a maelstrom of political and economic forces beyond its control. Well, I think we all are. And certainly, again, the private sector is not alone. It's not just the public sector. Private sector is caught in these maelstroms as well. But when we hit those kinds of reactive helplessness, then we end up reacting with things like Kevin O'Leary, who is now the biggest breakout star of the CBC since Don Cherry. And I guess that's saying something, but it's not saying something that makes me want to fork over my $54. And then we get to another model of victimization that Margaret Atwood talked about, which is recognizing your own role in the position that you are in and trying to respond. And I think that CBC really is trying. I mean, of course they're trying. I am sympathetic, even though I don't really sound it. But as John Doyle pointed out just last year in response to Wade Rowland, the CBC responds by doubling down on the bland, the palatable, and the safe. And I should note, when I was talking about this and reviewing it with my co-author, who also happens to be my husband, he suddenly went on this bizarre tirade about Heartland. And he's never seen it. But he just was like, I don't know, he'd had a bad day at work, but he just went like ballistic about why should I be paying for Heartland? Little House on the Prairie, Canadian style. And I was like, I liked Little House on the Prairie when I was a child, but okay. I get it. It's not cutting edge. It's not breaking new ground. It is a retread of Little House on the Prairie and endless other CBC shows about, the wild prairie, which I now am a member of, and I've never been to a ranch. So I'd like to suggest that we move to Atwood's fourth stage, that of the creative non-victim, which I think we're actually there, but we're not seeing it as such. And that's that vision that I suggested of public community-activated media. I think we're seeing a lot of really amazing activity going on, and I will be the first to agree that my romanticism does not include proper monetization. But I haven't known a lot of artists who made a lot of money either. So it's not like it's a new thing that artists and activists are not making a lot of money. They've never made a lot of money. And they are trying to figure out different ways, crowdfunding, various ways, far from figured out. I want to be clear. But I think that we're better off going in that direction and looking at what people are doing. The young people are never going to be activated into the CBC. When I was in grade 7, people used to make fun of the CBC. It's always been for like my age and older, it seems. You know, they're not coming. And you know why? Because they're not even watching TV. You know? They're watching viral videos. They're doing other stuff. They're making viral videos. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about publicly community-activated media. We need to rethink the very circuits of media and then rethink the circuits of public media. And I don't think broadcasting is our future. I think it is our past. So I will support a public, community-activated media, one that, yes, may be fractured, one that may only reach a small share of audience, one where its monetizations will be a lot smaller. But we're going in that direction anyway. And I'd rather put my tax dollars in that direction than reinvest them into a large-scale dream that also only reaches a handful of people. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Take it easy.
All right. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to introduce, is Dr. Zoë Druick. Zoë has written extensively on the history of media. I think her book, Projecting Canada, Documentary Film and Government Policy at the NFB, set off important questions about the original conceptions of nationhood in so many of our cultural institutions. She's working today, she's also published Perspectives on English Canadian TV, and she has published Cinephemera, or is about to publish Cinephemera. Did I pronounce that correctly? And which is about new screen histories in Canada. As she finds her presentation, and we put it up. Is this going to work? Oh, great. One. Yes. It's here. Yes. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Catherine. I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and thanks to my co-panelists as well as the Spry Lecture Foundation. It's a real pleasure to be here. The title of my talk is When More is Less, and we will see the PowerPoint in a moment. And I want to talk about media concentration over the last 15 years and the CRT's role in that, particularly through their group licensing policy. So today I'd just like to kind of sketch the situation in which we find ourselves, not so much the CBC situation that we've been hearing about, but more the situation of the convergence between telecom and broadcasting. And think about how, although we seem to have more TV, in a sense, than we ever have had before in this country, in both qualitative and in quantitative terms, I think we actually might have less. And I want, like I said, focus on how the CRTC in particular has enabled this shift. So as you guys know, the first decade of the 21st century, we saw a number of technological changes which have now become sort of part and parcel of everyday life. And these are the changes that mark the transition of television to what we now know as our digital platform. So 2003, iTunes Store, 2005, YouTube, 2007, iPhone, 2010, Netflix Canada. And this has really been the rise of what we might call the unregulated broadcast market in Canada. And it's radically changed broadcasting because now people are watching television on all these other platforms. This radically challenges the conventional broadcast policy mechanism in Canada of Canadian content. This is a policy that was put into place in the 1960s to support Canadian broadcasters, Canadian businesses, Canadian advertisers, and maybe also Canadian artists and Canadian viewers. And this new unregulated television market tends to be on demand, pay per use, or free, and obviously tied to computing rather than to television sets. So during this period, 2000 to 2010, if you were a cable operator, you might be getting busy figuring out a new business plan. And this is exactly what happened in this period, the first decade of this century. The cable providers and the telecoms made a concerted effort to take advantage of this sort of confusion, this lack of regulation, to vertically integrate and to combine platforms and content. And I have a great slide that shows you how, in particular, Rogers, Bell, and Shaw during this period became the three big players, as well as TELUS, which is the fourth big telecom but doesn't provide any broadcast content. And let us just say that the CRTC did not act boldly in this new media configuration. Instead, what we end up with is this situation where three companies account for 70% of all the media industry profits in Canada, according to a 2012 study, and 75% of all viewing in English distribution. Now, I wanted to talk in particular about Bell, which is the biggest of those companies, in 2012 when this chart that you can't see was devised. Bell was making a 1.7 billion in profits. They had, I'm not going to go into it, dozens and dozens of television channels as well as radio and so forth. But last year, in a highly publicized and somewhat controversial move, they took over Astral Media in a friendly takeover, which gave them another 24 channels, mainly in Quebec, as well as another 84 radio stations. And this was a move that really aggravated people because, in fact, the CRTC had denied the merger the year before. And there was this big Say No to Bell campaign that you guys remember that mobilized all this cultural nationalist, fair market kinds of rhetoric, send your message to Ottawa to oppose the takeover. And yeah, it was great to see these full-page ads in the newspaper, people standing up to corporate media, except for the fact that, as you know, the campaign was run by Quebecor and Cogeco, which are two huge media companies that just don't happen to have telecom capacity. And it was a typical thing where big businesses are all in favor of the free market until it disadvantages them, and then suddenly they want a lot of regulation. But the fear that they expressed that was overridden by the CRTC was that with all this content now, Bell is the biggest media company in Canada, would inevitably become a Canadian Netflix and would sort of help to bring about the end of cable and push all the other players out of the sandbox by being the only one that could really support this online platform. So you think that having this huge company, and in the chart that I have, you would see that Shaw is close behind. You would think that this might worry the CRTC, a body that regulates both telecom and broadcast, that even on the level of appearance, they would be embarrassed to see that there's this media oligopoly taking form that they have enabled. Even given the fact that the Broadcasting Act, the current one, is from 1991, and the Telecommunications Act is from 1993. So yeah, they're not the most up-to-date policy instruments. But even so, you think the CRTC might be a little bit embarrassed and concerned about the appearance of this media oligopoly. But no, what they actually did in 2011 was come up with this group licensing decision that I wanted to mention. Apparently, the CRTC is not at all concerned about these appearances, and they've even bent over backwards to make sure that these three big companies can make more money and offer us less content than ever before. And I don't want to go too much into the details of the group licensing decision, but just to give you the outcome of it, was that it allowed Canadian broadcasters to spread their costs out. So large-scale companies like these that owned multiple interests, to spread their costs out across their different platforms. allowing them for the first time to be able to buy expensive American franchises like the Real Housewives franchise, the Storage Wars franchise, the MasterChef franchise, and so on, from the US, thereby allowing them to bring onto Canadian television, big blockbuster type shows that advertisers would be happy with, and that audiences would want to watch. And all sorts of flexible accounting and very dodgy kinds of things were enabled in this policy. So partly I want to disagree a little bit with what we've talked about so far, which is that in many ways, the big broadcasters are not looking for niche, fragmented online audiences, but in a way they're looking for big, old-fashioned mass audiences, because for now at least, this is still what brings in the advertising dollar. Okay, so I didn't get to show you any of my slides, but I guess I just want to conclude by saying I think it would be fair to say that broadcasting in Canada, although it has never been less distinctive, if I can put it that way, or culturally distinctive, it has also never been more lucrative. But what's really missing right now, I think, is a grassroots kind of bottom-up vision of public broadcasting, which is different from what some of my co-panelists will speak about in a moment. I think there's lots of really vibrant activism happening, sort of grassroots, about net neutrality or participatory online culture or on-demand viewing even, but in a way that's taken the place of activism around broadcast. But for now, at least, you can really see that broadcasting is going strong in Canada, at least in the private sector. And broadcasters have been able to leverage the anxiety that the industry feels about new platforms and new technologies to attain all sorts of exemptions from the policymakers. So what if there really was a Say No to Bell campaign that also said no to Shaw and no to Rogers? It sounds sort of crazy, but I think we're at a moment where, Rudy alluded to this, there will probably be a new Broadcasting Act and a new Telecommunications Act in the offing, and it might be a combined act. So this is actually a moment when it is possible to maybe make a difference in the formation of that policy. And I have to conclude that no activism of that sort will come from the CRTC, given their track record, nor will it come from the CBC, frankly. But the history of Canadian broadcast shows us that progressive policy and progressive content responds to pressure from popular social movements, not from the state. And this I want to suggest is to invoke Spry, as Catherine has done. It's really these popular social movements that where we should be looking for vitality in this area, not the state or the United States. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. One of Graham Spry's most amazing slogans, and a great tribute to him. Thank you very much, Zoe. Our next speaker is Dr. Frédérik Lesage. He is with us in the School of Communication. His research is all in this high-tech stuff, software, creative practice, and mediation theory. And his talk today is on public media in the age of apps. And I hope this works, but we don't know. And I apologize to everyone.
So hello, everybody. I'm not here as an expert on broadcasting. My own interest is in how different kinds of creative practitioners think about design and use digital media as part of their work, the work that they do. So when I was invited to reflect on alternative futures for the CBC, it got me thinking about how people who work in public broadcasting think about media technologies. And I'd like to frame this reflection with, and here I would say the following question, but I would say with a question. What are the technological imaginaries of public media? Now, social scientists who do research in technology and society, like Patrice Flichy or others, use this concept of technical imaginaries to examine how people imagine the social, cultural, and political potential of technologies. How people who work in broadcasting at the CBC or with the CRTC or in other, among other broadcasters. So what are the technical imaginaries of public media? And I'm using this, how people at the CBC imagine what media technologies should look like in the future matters to the future of Canadian broadcasting. Let's look at planning documents like 2015 Everyone, Every Way, CBC Radio-Canada's 5-year strategic plan that ends next year. Here this is just one quote taken from the section where they talk about technology. It gives us an insight into a general CBC technical imaginary, if you like, one where technological design and change is an exogenous force, an outside force that they respond to. Let's refer to this technical imaginary as there's an app for that imagination or imaginary. Keeping up with the latest technological developments is the priority. Now, what does that mean? Well, from the perspective of creators, people who work at the CBC, this imaginary is about a constant technological churn whose only response from the part of the creators is an upgrade culture to try to keep up with the pace of technological change. Producers need to continually upgrade their skills and learn the latest apps, the latest technological fad, a pace that is set by digital media industries in Silicon Valley or elsewhere. And from the perspective of engagement with the audience, we see this imaginary as a kind of audience, as fickle consumers who are always looking for the latest technological solution for consuming content. It's just a matter of finding the right technological solution for a current technological problem and keeping up with the pace of what everyone else is doing. So with this, there's an app for that imaginary. Can we imagine an alternative? My objective here is not to find a technological fix to this problem, but to try to identify alternative ways for imagining a future for public media technologies. I want to present one example where people are thinking about potential alternatives. And in a blog post that I just wrote, a little piece for the Canadian Media Fund, Trendscape blog, plug, it's coming out on Monday or Tuesday, about an announcement that took place in the end of November 2013 by the British Broadcasting Corporation. They had just signed a memorandum of understanding with 4 big open data and open standards organizations in the UK, the Open Knowledge Foundation, the Open Data Institute, but also from the US, the Mozilla Foundation, who distributes Firefox, among many other things, and Europeana, around open data and open standards. Part of the aim of their agreement was to give clear technical standards and models to the organizations, to their organizations, but also to the organizations that they collaborated with, who want to work with the BBC, to give those using the internet a deeper understanding of the technologies involved and to facilitate the kind of collaborative processes for creating content online that's possible using these kinds of standards. So some of you might not be familiar with when I talk about open data or open standards. What does that mean? Really, rather than thinking of it as a specific technology or a technological solution to everything or to anything, rather, let's just think of it as a different way to imagine the future of digital media. Here, the quote, open data is data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone, subject only at most to the requirements to attribute and share alike. Now, I'm presenting open data as an alternative, but this isn't a fringe thing. Here I'm quoting David Eves, who's got a great running blog on open data here from Vancouver, where he says, once you have these people, Cameron, Obama, and Putin and the rest, talking about things like the G8 Open Data Charter. We're not on the fringes here. These are mainstream ideas, but mainstream ideas that haven't necessarily been adopted in the context of broadcasting or media more specifically. So let's look at a few examples. Here's some areas identified for potential future collaboration by the BBC and the Open Knowledge Foundation. So 1, supporting and developing the open internet and the open web. 2, metadata. 3, digitization. 4, access to archives. 5, a modern rights framework. And 6, digital skills. Obviously, I have no time to get into all of the details of this, but let's look broadly at some of the implications of looking at this as rather than as a solution. Again, let's look at this as an opportunity for the BBC and as a broadcaster for opening up a conversation about alternative technical imaginaries. From the perspective of the first three standards, we can look at them as having really interesting and significant implications for creators. That is, open standards for creators in creating a more open environment for sharing content and sharing the platforms for collaborating with outside creators or developers. And this is something that I'm using the BBC and their memorandum of understanding to start to illustrate this point, but this isn't something that isn't also taking place in Canada. I'm thinking, for example, of the RC Lab, or Radio-Canada Lab, based out of Montreal, that's just celebrated its 1-year anniversary, where their mission, this was a grassroots project started by some members of Radio-Canada in Montreal to accelerate, I'm bilingual, accelerating the digital culture at the heart of Radio-Canada. And again, here we're not talking about some kind of techno solution or technical fix where we're bringing in some new application. Rather, it's most of their work, and I spoke to Xavier Richard, who's one of their members, one of the guys who helped found this initiative. Most of their work is really about just creating the environment where geeks, technical aficionados can sit down and talk with reporters or other content producers at Radio-Canada and just talk about how can we change, how can we adapt new ways of approaching, new ways of thinking about how digital media can fit into the stories we want to tell, the content we want to create. And then from the perspective of the last three options for collaboration that were raised by the BBC, which I think have really interesting implications for this conversation, this alternative technical imaginary, is the last three have real clear idea of access and how we can think about access for audiences, how broadcasters connect audiences to this kind of to open data, to the digital content that's available online. Again, I can't spend too much time talking about it, but there is one of the major critiques around open data in the political forums or elsewhere is that it's an elite thing. It's something that's only there for those with the digital skills, the tools, the resources to access and analyze that data and make it work for them. But where broadcasters can really have an impact, where broadcasters really know their stuff, is in creating that access, going beyond having access to the data and making that data accessible. Right? How can the public start to engage with and get the kind of literacy required to know what to do with the data, to have the kind of standards for engaging with and understanding their rights in how they can use the content that's made available through sources like the BBC iPlayer, but through similar projects that could be possible here in Canada. So with that, I thank you. And I thank the technical staff for saving me, and I'll move on.
We need digital imaginaries and practitioners. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are moving to our final speaker, so hang in there, and we're very close to our open dialogue portion. I'm very delighted to introduce our final speaker tonight. We met her through open media. Reilly is actually the pioneer behind a number of digital citizen campaigns for openmedia.ca, which is a network of people and organizations working to safeguard the possibilities of the open internet based here in Vancouver. She designed fresh and engaging citizen campaigns. The most recent one was Reimagine BC, CBC, which actually accompanied the license renewal hearings that were going on at the CRTC. She is an organizer, facilitator, and writer with 10 years of experience in the not-for-profit sector. And we're going to try to get her going very quickly. She joined openmedia.ca in 2009 after having worked with diverse NGOs, including Amnesty International, Walrus Magazine, and the UN Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She has led the organizing team for the first Vancouver Change Camp.
So, yeah, I work for openmedia.ca, and most of what we do is run really large public engagement campaigns, so quite different from what you've heard from the other panelists. And about a year and a half ago, in the lead up to the federal budget that we knew was going to result in some pretty major cuts to the CBC, we decided to run a campaign called Reimagine CBC with the tagline, Reimagining CBC for the Age of Participation. So the first thing we did in that campaign was we ran this petition called Stop the Cuts, where we asked people to sign up saying that they oppose these kind of huge cuts to the CBC. This is a map of the 35,000 people who said stop the cuts to CBC. You can see here that support for CBC is very evenly distributed regionally, and that we were able to mobilize people all across the country right up into the north. We actually had a demonstration outside of the Yukon MP, Ryan Leaf's office, where there were more people in attendance than his margin of victory in the election. So 35,000 people said stop the cuts. They went out to places, into their communities, and they put up posters like the one you see here for James Moore, but we did these for all the different MPs, telling them to stop the cut. So these were people that were highly engaged. They did petition deliveries to the offices of the MPs. They said they didn't want to see this happen. And as a result, we were able to create a community of people who really believe in public media. And that's really how we define that community that participated in Reimagine CBC. And we really realized that the next thing you need to do to keep people engaged, this is what we've learned at Open Media, is you need to ask them what they think, what they want, what their visions for the future are, and not be afraid of that kind of participation, because when you ask people those questions, you get really, really interesting and insightful ideas. So we created this ideas forum online where anybody could submit an idea, as long as it was in support of public media, for how to reimagine the CBC as a leader in participatory, creative, and engaging media. And we had almost 500 ideas submitted. We then took those ideas, those near 500 ideas, I think it was 496, and we turned them into a really easy-to-use drag-and-drop tool. There was this one question at the front that asked you about your priorities for CBC, but it was followed up with 18 more questions about different things you believe CBC should do, asked you to rank those. It was easy to use, interesting, interactive, and partly as a result, 10,940 people participated. And at Open Media, we fight for the possibilities of the open internet. We think one of those possibilities is better democratic engagement. So a big question for us was, if we have a tool like this that requires some thought, how many people will participate? And we were really excited to see that we could get more than 10,000 people to do that in a few months. So what we found out when we asked these 10,000 people, then we had an event at the Vogue with 1,500 people. I see Tara from Gen Y Media is here. They successfully put that on. So sold out the Vogue Theater of young people wanting to talk about CBC. So I think anybody who suggests that young people really don't care about the CBC, definitely the CBC is having a harder time reaching young people, but there's also a really vibrant community of young people who love it and who see it as part of their daily lives and want to be more involved in saying what it should look like. I'm seeing some of the young people who are in this room nodding. Thank you. So yeah, we had this event at the Vogue, 1,500 people, a survey, 10,000 people filled out. And we had 5 really interesting findings that we presented to the CBC and took to the CRTC license renewal hearing. So the first one of these findings was that the CBC should focus on more courageous reporting with in-depth, uniquely Canadian content that holds powerful interests accountable. So 90.58% of respondents to this question expressed strong support for the idea of more courageous reporting. So this was an extremely robust finding. And I think it's partly because we live in a very paradoxical age. We're seeing these new forms of participation, but we're also seeing this kind of creeping authoritarianism. And so people want to know that there's a public broadcaster out there who can hold those powerful interests accountable. I also don't think that there's really a huge conflict between the mandates of the CBC to inform, enlighten, and entertain. I think that those 3 things go hand in hand, especially because we live in an age that's literally dramatic. So the nightly news should really be the most interesting thing on TV, and when I watch CBC and see really watered down human interest stories take the place of the really many exciting things that are happening around the world, I feel quite sad. And there's not much of a need to resort to infotainment in the world that we live in today. So we also had the second one, which was to prioritize radio. Canadians who believe in public media think radio provides the best value for each dollar invested and should not be cut in favor of more expensive TV, which is what's currently happening. Radio budgets are being cut in favor of TV. I'm echoing something other panelists have said here. It's really true that there's a lot that CBC can learn from radio, where they've had a lot of success and have loyal listeners. And young people especially are consuming media this way through podcasts. So 3 was enrich the digital ecosystem with the best content from CBC's past and present, freeing the CBC archives and bringing television and radio online. So something else that our 10,000 people would like to see the CBC do. We had some suggestions in our full report for how to deal with some of the issues around royalties, but people really see this content as something that's been publicly funded and therefore should be publicly available. 4 is collaborate with the right partners, those who have deep roots in community and can help the CBC tell authentic local stories. So this was a really big finding for us, that people understand that the CBC is facing these budget challenges, but they think that part of the way to deal with that is to collaborate better with local media producers. So to try and support an ecosystem of local media production, to team up with whatever your favorite kind of local producer of media is. If it's the Tyee or the Vancouver Observer or Vancouver is Awesome, it doesn't matter. But the idea here is that CBC should be working with those groups that are really embedded here and understand what matters and can tell those authentic local stories, because more and more we're noticing that those grassroots voices are finding it hard to make it into the national conversation. So that was a really big finding of our work. And then the 5th one, which I think is in some ways the most important, is that we should be using open and participatory processes to help shape a vision for the future of the CBC and to create an active community who supports that vision. So when I went to the CRTC and presented at the license renewal hearing, they were really intrigued by the process of Reimagine CBC, and they asked a lot of questions about it and called it a model of public engagement. And you may have noticed that they've tried to do something similar with their own future of television consultations. Unfortunately, the CBC hasn't really embraced this kind of model for making decisions about what its future should look like. I think internally with its employees would be a really great place to start. Many of us know that the CBC has some internal cultural challenges, and turning to the employees who really know the CBC best and should love it the most and asking them what they want to see for its future in a time where, as you've heard, it's got 4 years before even more dramatic changes are coming. That's going to be the way to find the most inspiring ideas and also build up the most really truly engaged support, which is going to be completely essential. And I really agree that by watering down the content and making it more kind of palatable and bland, they actually turn off the people who are the most likely to keep fighting for them. So it creates a really negative feedback loop. So that's kind of all I wanted to say. I'll leave you with the last nice little vision of our Reimagine CBC event. You can see some young people were out there writing down on this board what they value about the CBC. It says media democracy. So thank you.
And so now you can make it yours to reimagine the CBC. This concludes our tremendous lineup and quite a diverse range of ideas presented tonight. But all of them really start with you. So we can move to the mics now. And I propose we reserve the next 25 to 30 minutes for discussion from the audience. Apparently, in front of you, there is a button that if you push it, the mic will turn red. So I would like to ask our esteemed librarian to show us. Sylvia, would you mind? Would you mind pushing your button to show us how it works? Sylvia Roberts, our esteemed communication librarian, thank you. And very much a proponent for open archives, I might add. Thank you very much. So all you do is reach forward, push, and the red mic goes on, and there is a kind of queue of 3, and we will try to respond to you as soon as possible. I have a marvelous question thereabouts, please.
Me?
Dr. Hackett.
Yes, thank you very much. That was an excellent series of talks, very provocative. I just want to pose for anyone who'd like to care to respond, but I was particularly intrigued by some of Rudy's comments. And I wonder, here's my first question, whether anybody else feels that CBC is down a slippery slope from being a public to a state broadcaster, as the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting are currently arguing. So that's one question, because that fits with my own experience of watching the National as a regular viewer over the last 5 or 10 years. That it does seem, its ideological sort of parameters seem to be moving in the direction of the government of the day. Second question is also triggered by something that both Rudy and Ron said. I wonder if crowdfunding, as you call it, for public broadcasting would not result perhaps in class, generational, and even ethnic biases in programming ultimately. I think arguably that's happened to PBS in the States. I personally love Knowledge Network. It's more than half of my TV viewing. But then my mother lived in the Tower of London when she was a kid, so I have certain biases in this regard. I can never get enough British mysteries. But I think that there would be that risk that you'd tend to play, there'd be a sort of a kind of bias that you would get from advertising, but with a different basis. My third question, well, it's not really a question, it's a comment to Dr. Sullivan. It seems to me I'm very much a supporter of community media as well, but I don't see how we can do without a national broadcaster. It seems to me that, in effect, what you were asking was to replace survival, not with something more creative, simply, but with a death wish.
Thank you, Dr. Hackett,
okay, you.
who is one of the architects behind Media Democracy Day in the fall. I'm going to remind the panelists now, they push their buttons, and away you go. One thing I should advise you panelists, as well as people in the audience, thanks to Dr. Anderson, who has reminded us, that we can stand 3 or 4, which is it, Bob? Lights? 4? 4 lights on. So if you see 4 red lights, you have to wait a bit. Okay. Please. Rudy.
Well, I'd like to take the first one because it's always a great opportunity to speak to a supporter of Knowledge Network. And so I'm going to take your second question, which is a good one, actually, because I learned a lot of my crowdfunding or pledge from the time I worked at Houston Public Television at PBS. And there is the thinking that because British dramas on a Knowledge or on other PBS stations is popular, that it consumes a big part of our schedule. But in fact, out of our 164 hours a week that we broadcast, it makes up 8 hours. And the thing is that we put British dramas on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday evening, and it draws a lot of viewers. But when I go to partner events that are British dramas, people unfailingly tell me about the documentaries they watch. And we've built up audiences around our documentary strands. When I first came here, we weren't showing a lot of documentaries from Asia Pacific, so we started a strand called East is East, everything Asia Pacific, and within a year and a half, it became the most popular documentary strand week after week. So the point is that a broadcast schedule can play to different audiences at different times. Our schedule is made up of kids all day, every day, and arts and culture all night, every night. And every slot is directed at somebody else because not everybody sits there and watch, 24 hours of television just on your channel. A heavy viewer of any single channel is 3 hours a week. And secondly, on the question of state and public broadcasting, there's an uneasy tension. It's never one way or the other. I mean, I've been to China a lot, and it's one way. And I've been to PBS, and it's another. In Canada, there's just that there's that uneasy tension that forces a lot of self-censorship. I don't think the federal government's directing a Don Cherry to wave the flag, but the people running it are always on edge about their funding and try to play to the powers that be. And it's not. And I think that the governance issue makes it worse. The fact that the CEO is directly appointed by cabinet and that the board is directly appointed by cabinet means that one isn't responsible for the other. There's no real governance except for what they perceive to be the political pressures of the day.
Ron has a comment.
I agree with Rudy that it's the governance thing where you have to start to depoliticize the CBC. It has been reported that the existing board members each contributed $1,200 to the Conservative Party during the last run-up to the election. How do you even have a perception of an arm's length relationship with the government in power if the people who were put there by the government in power are in fact contributing to the continuation of that government? Second point, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind of the pervasive influence of advertising on the selection of content. How, on the one hand, can you have investigative journalists going after a company which may be a major sponsor of some part of the programming schedule, and have, on the other hand, an unbiased reporting. You can't do it. Take the governance issue and the commercials out of the mix, and you're on your way to maybe having a real public broadcaster. Because the people who are appointed by the government in power have, on the one hand, very little broadcasting experience, and on the other, no idea whatsoever of the real responsibility and accountability of a public broadcaster.
Thank you. I believe Rebecca also has a comment to the excellent questions.
Yes, hi. Thanks very much for your comment. I think my response back is actually, we already have this going on. It's already here. I don't turn to CBC to get my radical activist news media. I turn to other sources that are already in existence. I'll say most notably, perhaps, say rabble.ca, which has been around for a long time. But there's tons of places to go to get what we want in terms of when we start thinking about participatory, community-engaged, activist media. I'm obviously betraying my own left-leaning tendencies. I'm suspicious that I'm in rather sympathetic company in this room. And I would say that those who are not sympathetic to me have their own outlets for that. But I will tell you, I don't go to the CBC for it, and I am getting it. And so I'll give another example of even within entertainment, not just within news, because I think there's so many different platforms and genres we're talking about, and it's hard to distinguish between them. But it was a viral video went out by a Vancouver-based comedy troupe called, and it's apologies for sensitive ears, it's called I Fucking Hate That, is the name of the troupe. And they have how to be a hockey player and how to speak Canadian and how to be a mountain biker. And I felt that I got a really heavy dose of Canadian-identified popular culture from YouTube. They got their own channel on YouTube, and I sat there after watching a couple of those, and I went and watched a whole bunch more. So I think it's already there.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Go for the red.
I believe it's me.
Yes.
Thank you all for a stimulating evening, some really great ideas and thoughts.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm David Newman, part of School of Communication. There's probably most of the room is. But,
Thank you.
I also think when we're talking about the CBC, we need to look at the larger institutional ecology in broadcasting and what's happening with the private broadcasters and what has been hinted or suggested in some of what's happening for CRTC and this Let's Talk TV, and the suggestion that I'm certainly reading or getting, the feeling I'm getting from them, that the Canadian content requirements may well be in for a radical change, maybe demise, and how this also will change the landscape, I think, in Canada in terms of just what has been broadcast, what we are seeing on the screens. And so with that, I'm wondering if the CBC, instead of trying to be a national broadcaster where it doesn't really, it's difficult to be a national broadcaster in Canada, whether they actually go back to the debates that were had before the CBC with public broadcasting in the days of the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, and of having provincial control over the public broadcaster, and whether we would actually see a greater participation, greater audiences along the lines with the Knowledge Network if they were looking at the local concerns, the regional concerns, and so there were a confederation of public broadcasters on a provincial level rather than one monolithic national broadcaster.
Super questions, David. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Rudy on the regional question and then ask if anybody wants to speak up about the content regime.
I think that's an important issue. The one thing that's not happened in terms of the globe, all the great international brands have been spoken for by the big corporate entities, but the national things that happen in Canada haven't been. So at Knowledge Network, we put whatever money we can find, and it's always the challenge, is to BC content or Canadian content. And in fact, we rebranded the network again, evolved it into, and literally said it's British Columbia's knowledge network, because I went through a 3-year speaking tour of the province. Colleges, universities, chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, and partner appreciation events, just to say thank you. And half the people that supported Knowledge Network didn't know we were from British Columbia. We just assumed it. And they said, aren't you from the Seattle or Toronto? And I said, no, we're British Columbia. So we thought, well, we not only have to rebrand it, we have to put more money into specific British Columbia stories. And just 2 weeks ago, we launched this emergency room, life and death at Vancouver General Hospital at VGH. And now, and we told the producer that we were going to license the whole thing. We were going to, put in enough money to trigger the Canada Media Fund envelope that we have. They were going to go to tax credits. But that we asked them not to go to any other Canadian broadcaster, because we did not want to make any compromises for anything that was about healthcare outside of British Columbia. He said, this is it. Just, make it a real documentary series, not reality. Well, we broadcast it. And not only, this is a straight-up documentary. It could have been made 20 years ago in terms of technology, although it looked better because it was in high definition. But it was a straight-up documentary, no narration. We not only had 3 times the audience of CBC, we had 3 times the audience of CTV, and we beat NCSI on Global, their big blockbuster show, on a straight-up documentary. And I think playing to those regional content, telling those stories, they're really expensive. They're really risky. No one else wants to partner, no international people want to partner on you, but that's where you promote your own identity. And the CBC on a national level needs to do more of the same, because that's the place where you can really win the hearts and minds of Canadians, telling their own stories. And that takes money.
We have a comment on the CanCon regime from Zoe.
Really important question, thanks. I did want to mention that one of the things that this consolidation and conglomeration of the media companies that I was discussing, one of the outcomes is precisely the loss of regional and local content production, precisely because the efficiencies that they find in becoming such big companies is that suddenly all the offices are located in Toronto. So in fact, you're seeing more, in a way, so much money, so many possibilities, but actually less content. And that's exactly one of the types of content that's being lost. Another thing I wanted to mention about that came up in the group licensing decision in submissions made by the Media Producers Association of Canada, by the DOC, the Documentary Organization of Canada. A number of media producer representative organizations made precisely that argument, that they were losing opportunities to produce the kind of content they wanted to produce because of this. In terms of CanCon, again, if you look at the group licensing decision, one of the things that these big companies were able to negotiate was the reduction of Canadian content from 60% down to, in some cases, as low as 25%, because they're able to spread it across all of their different channels. They say, on this channel we'll show 60, and on this channel we'll show 70, but on this channel let us only show 30 or whatever. So they were able to negotiate that. So actually, I think you do see the reduction of Canadian content, which is a question that we do need to debate, how important the Canadian content regulations have been. And the final thing I wanted to mention in response to Rudy's point about the provincial public broadcasters is that the provincial, he can correct me about this, but I think the provincial broadcasters are able to articulate their mandate more closely to an educational mandate, precisely because education is a provincial responsibility in Canada. So I wonder if you would distinguish between an educational broadcaster and a public broadcaster in that regard.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to come clean publicly on this one. In terms of educational broadcasting, I would say that our educational mandate's really focused on our kids' programming. All our kids' programming is from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening. It's largely children 2 to 8 years old, and every program that we license or commission on kids' programming has to promote literacy or numeracy in good social values like caring and sharing, and a show cannot be built around merchandising. We don't do that. So that's truly our educational side to get kids ready to learn. And in the evening, we've repositioned ourselves, taken the educational element out of it and said we're public broadcasting. This is about lifelong learning. We're not looking to educate our audience in the evening. We're rather looking to open their eyes to something, inform them, perhaps motivate them to have a discussion with their partner, perhaps get them to open a book, perhaps take a trip or take a course. So it's, but the educational designation is how the provinces got around the CRTC and said, we're going to just designate it. It's a provincial authority, and the CRTC is just going to have to live with it. And that's how we came to life. And we've turned to be a lot closer to the PBS model.
Thank you. Quick reply from Ron, and then we'll go to a question in the audience.
People forget that we live in the second largest country in the world, 6 time zones wide, and we have, in effect, a confederation of communities. One of the big mistakes CBC made was when they cut local and regional programming back. When I was director of television in Vancouver, we had 33 hours a week of local programming where we could showcase what was going on here. And Toronto would send a reporter to Vancouver to cover a Vancouver story that the CBC Vancouver reporters were quite capable of explaining in a much more in-depth way, but the media concentration in the so-called Golden Triangle is one of the problems. One of the things I'm proud of tonight, this group here is from the West. Why have 3 panelists discussing something on the national without somebody else from some other part of the country giving their opinion? Why doesn't the CBC use its own facilities, and they have them, to put on forums like this right across the country in every university and broadcast them and explain to the public and ask for the public's input? It's there. Why don't they do it?
Thank you, Ron. Question from the audience. And please introduce yourself. Sylvia?
Oh, yes. I think this gentleman over here has been waiting for a while, if you want.
I'm sorry? Where?
Over here, in the gray.
I'm sorry. Please, you first.
Hi. Thank you. So I just want to ask if this is just sort of open to anyone on the panel about if the CBC has a role to play as perhaps a coordinator or something akin to Canadian Press in a way. And what brought that up was Daphne's comment about having, you write a story for print and then suddenly it's on the morning news on the radio. And I'm sure anyone who's done some writing has had that happen to them. It just seems like the CBC could be fulfilling a role as sort of driving traffic towards local media because they have such a huge internet reach. I believe CBC.ca is one of the most popular websites in Canada. And it seems like since most of the private media outlets already pay into the CBC with the Canada Television Fund, I believe, it seems like it's just something that perhaps CBC might have an obligation to do. Similarly, I'm just wondering if there's, if anyone's familiar with the radio side, if there's opportunity for CBC to, because the private networks in Canada collaborate very deeply with private networks in the States, and I've seen the CBC radio sometimes, and CBC TV collaborates with other public networks. Like I recall several years ago there was collaboration with Australia Broadcasting Corporation for a news program, and CBC Radio 1 plays some, I believe, Irish and Czech news in English. So I'm just wondering if that's successful and if that has, I guess, viewership value in such an immigrant society as Canada.
Fantastic. Daphne? Our news expert.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sort of a bit taken aback by the idea that CBC would do that sort of role for broadcasters, because of course it would be doing it for private broadcasters. I think one of the, everybody keeps, I mean, we've got these 2 different streams, right? People are worried about media concentration, and yet we're supposed to share more and collaborate more. And I'm not sure how we find a balance that works. You mentioned the Canadian Press. The Canadian Press, for people who don't know, is it's owned by all of the newspapers. It's a cooperative owned by the newspapers. And there have been attempts, the company that I work for, in one of its previous incarnations actually got rid of Canadian Press because the newspaper group is larger than Canadian Press, and the big beneficiary of our company being part of it was that the Globe and Mail got everything that we had, and it's one of our large competitors. So this notion of collaboration, I think, is a difficult one. I think it's more likely that people in the media, because I think we're at the survival of the fittest part. I think that what we're going to see is collaborations between like-minded groups. And ironically, I think in Postmedia's previous incarnation, the Aspers may have had it right, where they owned Global and they owned newspapers, and that might have worked. I don't know how it would play out these days. But I think, for me, the more comfortable collaborations and funding models are maybe through privately funded organizations that would be set up to do investigative reporting. But there are, of course, like at the Olympics, there are things like host broadcasters. So I think there could be some savings if you did some host broadcaster kinds of things.
Now to Sylvia.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sylvia Blake. I'm a student at the School of Communication. And firstly, thank you so much for this panel. It's been super, super useful for me and very interesting. My question is predominantly for Rudy, but I'm sure the others would be interested in weighing in. You make a very interesting and a very bold call for regulation of the internet and specifically for Netflix. And I tend to sympathize with you quite a bit in regards to Netflix, perhaps in many ways getting a free ride and perhaps providing some fodder for calls for vertical integration on the parts of the large broadcasters. I was wondering, my question is, what would you envision a regulatory framework for services, over-the-top services, such as Netflix? What would you envision it looking like? What would it include?
You know, the short answer is I don't know. Because regulation isn't really my thing. I just have to live with it as a broadcaster. But, you know, for us, we're developing our website. We're about to launch our third generation website, and we're seeing more and more of our broadcasting over the web. And so I talked about the emergency room. It had 196,000 viewers on the Tuesday night at 9, and about 24 hours later, it had 80,000 more views just web plays on the web page, and 350,000 page views. So leaving aside the page views, the 80,000 videos was just broadcasting by other means, broadcasting over the internet. And anyways, we have to obey, you know, well, we would anyways because we're a public broadcaster, but through the Broadcasting Act, we have to have a minimum level of Canadian content, and we spend as much as we can on Canadian content. Commercial broadcasters have a minimum quota, and they have to obey the rules of the road, and in a very competitive race. And Netflix comes in and is essentially a broadcaster. It's a video demand broadcaster, and it has no rules of the road. And of course, it's eating everybody's lunch on that one. It doesn't eat our lunch because that isn't what we're offering. We're not a purveyor of programs like Netflix is. We're a purveyor of programming. In other words, people come to Knowledge Network because they like our decision making. We look at all the crap, so you don't have to. That should be our new tagline, I think. So we're looking at people who are about selective. And I don't know what a regulatory regime would look like. I just know that the CRTC has to look at it. I fortunately, on Monday, on Family Day, the commissioner, the chairman of the CRTC is coming out to British Columbia. And I was given a call and said, I'd like from one of the regional commissioners to bring them out to Knowledge Network. And I said, sure. By the way, you know, Monday is Family Day in British Columbia. And he said, oh yeah, you're right, better give him a call. He says, he's coming out anyways. You know, and I said, sure, and I'm bringing in my staff because it's an obviously good position. I'm going to put it to him on it to say, you should look at regulating it. I don't know what those mechanisms are, but there are finer minds to look at it. I think the concept is what people have to agree to. You can, why wouldn't you regulate it? You regulate everything else.
Well, this just about concludes the public conversation. I've got time for 2 more, and we've got 2 reds, and I'm having trouble picking out the reds, so I'm glad everybody is talking to me. Let's move from the front, and thank you for waving.
Hi, I'm Tara Mahoney. I'm a student at the School of Communications, and I work at Gen Y Media. My question is about just this kind of looming 4-year period that was alluded to, and the fact that the Reimagine CBC campaign has concluded, and as Reilly mentioned, they didn't really pick up on those really insightful recommendations very much. So how do you, what's next? How do you get the CBC to listen to what citizens want? How do you persuade them to change in some of these really innovative ways that have been presented tonight when it doesn't seem like they want to, or maybe they're backed into a corner or whatever?
Well, Reilly?
Yeah, I really wish that I had a good answer to that. I've gone to CBC and done talks, and they've been poorly attended. I'm here speaking about it. I think a lot of the work that open media does is about showing people that these participatory processes are really positive and not scary. So even the work that we're doing right now that isn't directly about the CBC, I see as advancing the same kind of agenda to make organizations recognize that these kind of participatory models are a way to revitalize themselves. So we're using the same tool that we used for the CBC campaign now to try to crowdsource copyright policy in Canada, because we know that really, really restrictive laws around sharing are going to really crush this emergent digital culture. And you can see that at openmedia.org/crowdsource if you're curious. But the fact that we continue to try to pioneer those models, to me, is a way of trying to make them less scary and more publicly acceptable. And so hopefully organizations like the CBC will come to embrace them. But I think also people in this room have some role to play, or can play some role in trying to encourage CBC to function differently, because it is, our tagline at the end of Reimagine CBC was "Make it yours." So even on the Reimagine CBC website, you can still download that report and send it to your MP, or send it to the CBC itself and say, these are recommendations that are of value, and I would like to see you carry them out. Yeah, because we can be, I think as Zoe was saying, there hasn't been much of a really sustained activist movement around broadcasting, and that needs to happen, and we all have a role to play there in saying that we want CBC to evolve in these ways.
Thank you. And finally up here.
Sheila Bissonette. I'm a student of communications at Simon Fraser University. So I wanted to, first of all, thank the panel and everybody who spoke tonight. There was a comment made in respect to supporters of the Conservative Party serving, I think that comment was made by you. I can say, I don't represent any party here, but I can say that the sentiment that's felt here tonight in terms of the CBC, the reasons may be different, but it's also the same sentiments on the other side. So I do wonder what the commonalities are in terms of the frustrations on both sides, whether you're left or right. And then my other question, and I just wondered if anybody also had that sense that no one really feels ownership or satisfaction. So the other question just being in terms of the change in demographics of who's watching TV, because I can say there's a change there, and that there's a certain demographic that doesn't even turn on the TV anymore. We get everything from the internet. So how that sort of connects into all of this. But thank you.
Comment? Rudy.
It's a good question that you bring up about the political makeup of a board. And, I do actually, I'm one of those that believes that a government does have the right to appoint a board to its own liking, because that's, they've been the elected people. But my experience with boards is that, they come in as often as partisans, usually as citizens in good standing, and it's the job of the leadership to make them love the institution and not to come in with whatever agenda they came into, that they become stewards of that institution, and that's their duty. And my experience with boards is that really good boards, no matter whether they're conservative, liberal, or whatever, or NDP actually, because I've served under all three, they protect the institution. I found when we were under privatization review by probably the harshest conservative government I've ever experienced when I was living in Ontario, we were under privatization review, and I said to my fearless leader at that time, a true genius of public broadcasting Canada, Peter Herndorf, I said, what is it about, at the Queen's Park, the provincial parliament, what is it about them that what's their agenda? Do they hate us and that? And he says, the problem isn't that people there, politicians, hate us. There's nobody there that particularly hates us. There's nobody that loves us either. And I found the same thing when I came to Knowledge Network. It had been kind of under privatization review for some time. And I decided, I've learned a lesson, and the real enemy of public broadcasting in the political class is most people don't have a clue what it is, how it works, or what its value is. That ignorance is our biggest enemy, because most people, and even in political life, I'll betray my middle-of-the-roadness on this one, most people that pursue a political life, like an MLA or an MPP, it's not an easy life, and most people are dedicated to public service. There are the crazy people and the power-mad people, I'm sure, but my experience is most people are dedicating themselves to a very difficult job and want to do the right thing. And when it comes to public broadcasting, most of them don't know how it works, or they just don't know. And it's our job to both from people like myself in the industry and the public to articulate why it's important to them and to show. And one benefit of being a public broadcaster that has to ask for the public is I've got 38,000 people at my back, and a lot of those MLAs and cabinet ministers, when I go see them, will tell me about the programming that their spouse watches, or that their parents watch, or that their kids raised on. They refeed it back to me, and I make sure that they connect the fact that our annual grant is dependent on that. So that I think that ignorance, more than partisanship, is the enemy. And I think I'm a big believer in the concept of Nixon to China. You want to open up China, get a xenophobic, Republican, right-wing government to do it. It was Nixon actually opened up China for the United States. I've had the best of luck with people that are the perceived right-wing conservative governments, because public broadcasting in many places started under conservative governments. So it's not partisan. I think people have to transcend that, because if you live by that sort of partisanship, you're going to die by it when there's a change of government, and there will always be a change of government. And I think it's important to remember it's for everyone.
A short follow-up here for Ron.
There is an exception. The people of Quebec certainly understand and love their public broadcaster. The Conservative minority government cut $125 million from the cultural envelope of Quebec. And guess what the voters did? They threw the bums out. And my wish and dream is that English-speaking Canada says, we're not going to take it anymore, and we're going to change this institution for the betterment of us. We own it. It's ours.
Thank you. I'm struck, and I want to speak for the radical dreamer, the Graham Spry vision here. Each generation must reinvent the CBC and make it their own. And I think the challenge today is much more complex, as our panelists have wisely pointed out, because we really need to retain a public non-commercial space. And I would argue a space free of this partisan, mindless adversarialism to really address those critical democratic issues that face all countries and all peoples in our struggle to seek social justice and other reasons. I know that that's what he fought for, and I know he believed you could join hands across the Parliament in order to do so. And I believe in the next election, we will be faced with fundamental challenges in choosing our vision of Canada for the future. So I thank you all for coming tonight, and I thank particularly the panelists for their courage, their candor, and catalyzing, really, conversation that I hope will go somewhere. Our intention is to put this in public place, to make it available to people like Monsieur Blais, the CRTC commissioner. But in particular, I'm going to take special care to bring this to Robin Spry and others in the family, because I think they will be heartened to hear the case for a public movement is still being made. Thank you so much tonight.